everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm super excited about this episode of Scale Up Soundbites, the first one of 2025. And joining us today is the one and only Yaniv Bernstein.
I'm more of a Bernstein, but that is...
Bernstein is probably correct, mate. I'll get that right for next time. But who I've been following pretty religiously across LinkedIn and a few of his startup podcasts. He's a co-host of the Startup Podcast for all of you who don't know, and I've seen him sort of wear a few hats throughout his career. Mainly started following you, Yaniv, when you joined Airtasker, probably like 6 years ago.
It's been a while then.
Yeah, 8 years. I don't know. I can't remember. As a VP of engineering, and then I saw you got promoted and stuff
Yeah,
like that. Or virtually, or creeping out on LinkedIn and stuff. But and then I saw you launched your own startup. The around this, it was kind of like the circular economy of hardware products, which circular, which I thought was quite cool. And just always following your musings about startups as well. And obviously you always leverage a lot of your experience of working with Google and in the positions that you've had. So really, really great content of what we've been following. And I think a lot of people in the tech community, particularly in Australia, obviously get behind it. And I'm really, really excited about having you on to have a talk about all things startups and kind of like what we're seeing in the industry as well. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
My first question is like for someone to get to, I guess, talking a lot about startups and, hosting your own podcast and everything like that, there's got to be a certain level of passion about it, right? Just do this for, obviously shits and giggles. Where does that passion come from? Where do you think it comes from?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, my career, it's not really been a traditional, I guess, startup career. As you mentioned, I actually spent 10 years at Google, which, obviously, especially by the end, was quite a big company. So I was a big company guy. And I think I really got very interested in I got very outcome oriented. I got interested in how do you actually drive results for your customers. And I think eventually at a big company, you become a bit abstracted away from that. You're sort of doing your small part. You're a cog in a really big machine, and you're quite disconnected from the results. And so I eventually got kind of frustrated by that. And, a mentor of mine suggested that maybe I should look at startups, and I did that. And I think that agency, that ability to move from, this is what I think we should be doing, this is the outcome we're trying to drive, to actually being able to drive that outcome and make the decisions, do the things that are necessary for that, was really exciting for me. And I think that was the first sort of shoe to drop. And then the next thing is like, I started looking beyond my own startups that I was working at, such as Airtasker, and mentoring other startups, doing some advisory work, eventually some angel investing. And I kept seeing kind of the same challenges coming up over and over again. So like on the one hand, I saw, wow, like it's such a great thing to be able to have such agency and really have such a huge amount of impact on the world. On the other hand, there was this frustration that, well, people keep sort of tripping over their own feet and making the same mistakes over and over again. And so I got really passionate about how can I help startups make fewer mistakes so they can actually focus on that incredible impact that they can have in the world.
Yeah, how good. And that was the sort of catalyst for the podcast, by the sounds of it as well. But also the coaching.
Exactly, all of those things. Yeah, I think that the podcast actually, it was like the backstory is it started very much as a whim. Like I knew my co-host Chris just online, right? And we'd started talking. We had a couple of conversations just about the startup world, and I saw someone who had some of the same philosophies as me, some of the same frustrations as me, and I just one day I was like, hey, should we record a podcast? And using these amazing new online technologies like Riverside, it didn't take a lot of setup to do that. And so we recorded it and shared it, and we had a lot of fun, got enough positive feedback to keep us going, and it just kind of went from there, grew a life of its own. But it came from that sense of like, if we can help people understand the rules of the game, like what it actually takes to build a startup, so these founders with all of this passion and energy and insight can actually do the right things and and achieve the outcomes that they're hoping to, then that's a really rewarding thing to be able to do.
Yeah, and particularly I think with a tech startup, and there's probably a lot of people that listen to your podcast and tune in that aren't from a tech background, right? So, and then maybe the other side of things that are from a tech background but don't have much of the business acumen side of things in terms of like raising funds, dealing with VCs, dealing with all the other sort of intricate details about scaling and or building a business. And I think one of the key parts of what I love to do is sort of what I'm married to is scaling the business, scaling startups, and it's kind of like passion to why I got into recruitment in the first place. And it's sort of like a lot of what you talk about in terms of finding the right talent. I've seen a lot of your posts have been around it for those teams, for the specific roles, for the specific business. Make sure that the values align. I think when you just mentioned there with Chris that you found someone online whose values aligned, that was encountering the same problems, and you thought you could create some great content. I think that's it's almost like a fire, like a spark of a fire, like can turn into an inferno, particularly when you're building a business as well. If when you can really find and identify the right talent that have the same values, the tech skills are usually there, but usually a lot of those other skills can be taught or stuff. But those values are really sort of what's ingrained and keep people in an organization as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So from the crux of it, what I'd love to talk to you about first is, I guess, with your experience from working in Google and then working in sort of like a bigger startup. I think they're probably more almost like that scale up phase when scale up phase,
scale
and
ups.
now your own startups and stuff like that, and doing all the coaching. The differences in the people, the teams that are in these organizations, where do you think it sort of starts? Like if you're looking to hire people for a startup specifically, what sort of character traits do you think you're looking for, beyond technical ability? Obviously that's going to be one and a checkbox, but is there something else? Like what do you think from your experience which really works?
Yeah, I mean, look, it does depend a bit on stage, and maybe we can come back to that. But
Sure.
there was this old blog called Joel on Software that was, back in the days when blogs ruled the internet.
Yeah.
And this guy Joel Spolsky, who I think is one of the founders of Basecamp, not Basecamp. Anyway, one of those sorts of startup that does things its own way. And he said when it comes down, he wrote a lot about interviewing. He said when it comes down to it, when you're interviewing someone, you're really just trying to figure out two things. One, are they smart? Two, do they get things done? Right? Smart gets things done. Because there are people who are smart but don't get things done. They kind of spin their wheels. They like to discuss and debate, and they don't just have that action bias. And then you have people, of course, who are not that smart and like to get things done, and they're really dangerous. And then you've got people who are neither, and obviously they're sort of non-starters. And that's generic hiring advice in a sense, but I think at a startup, that gets things done. Like you have to turn that up to 11, right? Like at a startup, you've got nothing. You're trying to make something from nothing, and so having a kind of extreme action bias, especially at the really early stages, is just so important. And then I think, the third thing I'd add to those two pillars at the early stage, going all the way through to scale up, is a high tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, right? If you're at a big company, you have an onboarding, you have a job description, you know what your job is, you know what your job isn't. You've got people who you can rely on to help you with things. You know what your next quarter is going to look like. You know what your targets are. You know what your product is. You know what your ideal customer is. At an early stage startup, you've got none of that. So you're coming in as an employee of a company that is just figuring out what on earth it's even about. And you have to be the sort of person who can not only tolerate that, but is actually energized and excited by that. To be like, holy shit, we are pioneers figuring out what we're trying to do here, and no one's going to tell me what it is. And I think that is such an important trait for an early stage type employee.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's that hunger and drive for solving those problems and even figuring out what those problems are in the first place, right? That really
Exactly,
comes
yeah.
through. I like that. It's like that. I haven't read that blog. I know, but I do like that when you said, are they smart and can they get things done? Yeah, because you're absolutely right. There's a lot of smart people out there, but it's like, do they apply and do they get things done, or do they just like the look of it?
Yeah. And at a bigger company, there's actually a place for people who are smart, but less on the get things done scale.
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
first of all, the workload expectations are lower. Secondly, the people who are, maybe writing reports, doing research, sharing some knowledge at a big company, that can be valuable. But
Mm.
at a small startup, you need to actually get something done, whether it's shipping product or closing deals or whatever it is, it has to be a real action out in the world, not just a reflection or a synthesis of knowledge. And so, yeah, not everyone is cut out for that.
It kind of leads it nicely into the next part of like the teams. And I think in a startup, I know what I really wanted to talk about was the whole role of a principal engineer. But I think where we could probably start first is if you are doing a startup, what would you have your founding team be if you were building a startup?
Founding team. So first of all, like, you've got your actual co-founders, and I do think it's important in this day and age to have a co-founder. If you're building a software startup, to have a technical software background, that you want a technical co-founder. It is really hard to succeed without that. And then you want a founder who is able to do more of the commercial side, right? Someone who can raise capital, who can communicate effectively, who can sell, who can partner and stuff like that. So sometimes that's the same person. There are
Mm.
solo founders out there, but I think two is a really great size for a founding team. And that's the sort of pairing that I'd look for. And then beyond that, I guess you're talking about like who do you hire? And I actually think that startups often hire people who are a bit too experienced, I think, for what they're looking for. And the mental model that I would nearly go for is that at the beginning, founders should do everything. And then when there's just too much on their plate and they need to be able to delegate a specific piece of work and they understand some of the shape of that piece of work, then they should hire someone to do that thing, right? So, if you take the example of sales, which I think is a common one, there's this idea that founder-led sales, and I agree with this idea, is really important, right? No one is going to know how to sell your product as well as the founder. And you are not in a position where you can hire a salesperson and have them be effective until you, as the founder, have been able to close some sales yourself, right? So
Mm.
you actually know what the customer looks for, what resonates, and so on. And then you can hire a salesperson or a head of sales and get them up to speed. But you, as the founder, kind of own that messaging. Similarly, for product, something I've seen done wrong is founders who hire a product manager relatively early on. If you're a founder, if you're the CEO, you are the product manager, right? You understand what it is that your customers want. You understand, you have a vision what the product is that is going to be built. And
Mm.
so I think it's very dangerous to hire a product manager and delegate that to them because they don't have that same passion, that same context, that same insight that led you to found the startup in the first place. Conversely, if you hire a product manager and hold on to all of that product vision yourself, you'll often find the product manager is just sitting there twiddling their thumbs, trying to figure out what the hell their job is, and feeling kind of disempowered by the CEO because they thought they were coming in to be the product manager, but they're not really allowed to make any decisions. And so,
Yeah.
I think what you really want to be doing is waiting until there's just a very, not very, sorry, a relatively clear sort of shaped hole in your ability to execute, and then you fill that hole. And I think that's sort of the way you grow. It's nearly like, you're splitting up the leaf, right? You
Mm.
say, okay, at the beginning, it's just the top layer, it's just the founders, just the C level. And then once you reach a certain scale, you're like, I can now hire, I can see the sorts of shapes below the C level. But I think where things can often go wrong is when founders hire to fill gaps that they have. So they're just like, oh, I don't understand how this works. I don't know how to do accounting. I don't know how to do sales. I'll hire someone to do that for me. The founder's the ultimate generalist, right? They need to figure out how to do each of these things
Mm.
themselves before they make the hire.
Yeah. Okay. That's super. So but from the sounds of I'm listening correctly, probably isn't one sort of script or playbook for every startup. It really goes to like the needs of that business at the time. If you were to get that experience as the founder, like you said, if they're the generalist of everything, and then they get good at, or they might not be great at sales because they might not be the background, but they've gone through that process and sold their product, so they know that cycle and inventory, or
Yeah.
understand the books and that sort of thing. But then on the technical side of things as well, when what developing the product, just gets too much for that the the co-founder, the technical co-founder, the CTO, they would look at building out someone to help aid that. Is that what, like, that side of things as well? Like, would you, if you had the money to begin with, would you set up a founding team, like an engineering team, if you knew what that would look like? Would there be some sort of plan around doing that, or is it just purely based on I've tried to do the front end, I'm a back end engineer myself, I've tried to play around the front end, it's too much for me, and then hire a front end developer to do it?
Yeah. Look, I think in the case of engineering, that's an interesting one where, like I said, I do think it is a massive advantage to have a technical
Yep.
co-founder who is actually doing some of the work themselves. Because if you think about it, if your startup is based on software, and most startups are, why? Because of the amazing leverage that software gives you, right? The
100%.
ability to just multiply it at near zero cost. And so if you're building a software startup and you don't know how software is built, then you're at a massive disadvantage. Now, there are many exceptions. There are many successful startups that have only non-technical founders, but it is a disadvantage. And if you are a non-technical founding team and you're not able to bring on a technical co-founder, then yes, you want at least a founding engineer. And I guess maybe that's sort of what
Yeah.
you're asking, Sam. It's sort of like your founding engineer, even if they're not fully a co-founder, they've got to at least be a bit of a co-founder, right? They need to have that sort of entrepreneurial spirit, that willingness to work really closely with the founding team to build what needs to be built, to have that action bias and so on. And by the way, this is tactical, but I think it's really important. You need to treat them that way. That means they should have a substantial bit of equity, right? Yes, they're an employee, they're not a full member of the founding team, but they are so critical to the success of what you're doing that you'd better make sure that they have skin in the game. And yeah, I think that is probably the most common sort of founding role that is not an actual founder that you would hire for. Like I said, a founding salesperson, much more problematic because really, given that it is, while sales is very much a skill, and I respect hugely what salespeople do, it's not a technical skill in the same way that software development is. And as a founder, like you said, you may not be great at it, but you've got to at least get out in the market and try to sell your thing before you hire a salesperson, because otherwise they will have no idea how to sell it, even if they're really good. And again, there might be the odd unicorn out there who you can hire and will be able to sell the thing that you don't know how to sell. But then you're putting your whole business in their hands, and that's not a smart thing to do. So you've really got to figure that out on your own. But yeah, then beyond that, it's like you nearly want to feel like there are gaps where you're doing something yourself and you just don't have, you hit the limits of your time or skill, and then you can hire for that. So for example, initially as a founder, you should probably be doing all the financial stuff yourself as well, right? You should be doing your invoicing and collections and stuff, because this is the nitty gritty of how a business actually works. And then when like the accounting becomes too much work or too complex for you, then you can bring in a financial controller or an accountant or whatnot. But if you bring them in straight away, first of all, you're probably wasting money. Secondly, you don't know what you're looking for. And thirdly, it's going to be a hell of a lot of difficulty managing that person if you don't actually know what it is that they do, even at a high
Yeah.
level. So do it yourself first is really my advice.
Yeah. No, yeah, I like that. I love that a lot, actually. All right. Fantastic. Thanks. What I originally reached out to you to have a chat about is we've been doing a fair bit of work with startups and scale ups and some enterprise companies, actually, looking over the past 12 months, looking and helping them attract principal engineers into their team. And it's been a bit of a good little niche for us as a business, because over the past 12 months, like, you've been around tech, the market has not been great. And when I say not been great, been pretty bad. In fact, it's probably like the second worst year that we've had in terms of, I would say, like funding, growth, potential, that sort of thing in 2024. And the worst one was 2023 for us anyway. But I think where they sort of struggled with was these principal engineer roles. And it was kind of funny when we were sitting down with a few people who were in the hiring manager space. So it would have been like a CTO or a head of engineering or even like a chief people officer. And they had like these ideas, and it was usually around three core characteristics of what makes a principal engineer. But then when they went out to market, there was people who were really good at one, maybe two, but not really all three. And that's why they engaged us in the first place, because they couldn't really find them themselves. What do you think, that adoption of these titles, because it's also a title that I've seen slowly get more and more popular in Australia, particularly in the last couple of years, staff and principal engineers, seen it, popped up in all pockets of, the Atlassians and a few other places as well. But then now it's become a lot more popular, right? So like, CBA's got, Big's hire over them and stuff like that, but I never really saw it as much. What do you think your experience with Google as well? I don't know what their company structure was like there or anything like that, but particularly back when you were there. But how have you seen that role change over time? What would you do? There's about 5 questions here. Sorry. I think we should probably start with the start. Is what do you think the role of a principal engineer is to begin with?
Well, I'll ask that in a moment, but I'd love to turn the tables on you for a second. And you said there are 3 characteristics that a lot of the companies are looking at. I'm curious to know what you're seeing.
Yeah, so look, when I say characteristics, they're pretty broad, all right? But the 3 that we usually got when we boiled down to it was technical knowledge of usually one particular thing. So it could be like an expertise in a domain. So that would be like whether it's back end or front end, or it could be a mix of both, or it could be, so it was like and that technical knowledge is the ability to code really well, because it's very much still like a hands-on role. So that was like the first one that was, pretty easier to find. The second one was knowledge of systems and architecture as well, and sort of being able to navigate that. So while the role wasn't like about being an architect, but they could navigate architecture quite well, and systems and how they intertwine quite well. So, if this should hit the fan, they're able to get stuck in and navigate around that for the reasons to deploy or whatever that might be. And then the third one was the ability to influence. Now, that was like a huge thing in terms of the role itself, because it really didn't have direct line management responsibility of what we found. So the ability to influence and persuade people to get shit done properly was huge in that role. But it was also like the other way where they were influencing C-suite. On decisions that were technical decisions, so helping CTO teams influence why things happen or why it needs to be sent. If there was a case of technical debt, why that was happening, and explain the reasons behind it, and also influence around like solving problems as well. So and even like identifying those problems too. So being able to sort of switch from technical speak to technical people, so in your technology team to get stuff done, but also using your business acumen to communicate the technical things to the business people to get stuff done. So they were the three things that sort of combined together. We're actually doing an article about this coming out soon as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like that's helpful. And there's sort of 2 things going on here, right? I think one is a level of title inflation, right? Where it's like, especially definitely staff engineer and potentially to a lesser extent principal engineer. Those titles are coming in because the term senior engineer has kind of itself inflated, right? And this is just a standard thing. Like you get people with 3-4 years experience calling themselves senior engineers. So then the people with 10 years experience are like, I'm not the same as them. I'm a senior engineer, and that can be staff or principal. And so, that's just someone with like more experience and sorts of things that are attendant on that. And then beyond that, like, there's 2 sides to approach this. One is, what does the title mean? And the other is, what are the companies actually looking for, right? And it nearly comes back to what I was saying before. And I'm generally a big fan of, instead of choosing a title or coming up with a generic job description, kind of describing that hole in your organization, the shape of that hole that you're trying to fill, and then looking for someone who is the right shape to fill that hole. And so, yes, I think often a principal engineer is someone who's got that deep domain knowledge and the ability to actually leverage that, because they're an individual contributor, but they're expected to be a multiplier. And maybe that's sort of one way to think about it, Sam, is that if you think about the difference between individual contributors in general and, let's say, management, is that individual contributors, and this is a simplification, right? But an individual contributor is measured on an additive value, right? That it's sort of like you add one engineer, you get an engineer's worth of extra delivery value and so on. Or if you get a more senior engineer, you might get two engineers worth, right? Whereas with a manager, you say, oh, okay, they might make the whole team 10% more effective. And so you're measuring their contribution as a multiplier of the team that they're leading. And so a principal engineer occupies this interesting middle space where they're an individual contributor, right? They don't have that management responsibility, as you say, but they're expected to provide a multiplier effect, right? Where it's like they're supposed to make the whole team more effective. And that can be through influencing, that can sometimes be through building infrastructure that the entire rest of the team relies on. So they're making the entire team more productive. It can be through pioneering new technologies. I think one thing that's very timely now is AI, right? Principal engineer can be the sort of person who figures out how AI can be leveraged to make the product much more powerful or to make the production, the development lifecycle much more efficient and so on. So I think that's sort of fundamentally it. It's like they're a multiplier, but they're doing it without that management influence because the sorts of work that they're doing to perform that multiplication with don't require that organizational influence, or rather don't require that organizational ownership and accountability, but rather it is about working in a way that makes everyone more effective. And then it comes down to, okay, well, depending on the needs of your company, it could be more about influence. It could be more about deep domain influence. It could be more about, it could be more about deep domain knowledge. It could be more about the ability to just join lots of dots and like get things done in a way that with a level of technical mastery that nobody else has. And yeah, you know, if you're looking for all three, then maybe, to your point, Sam, it can be a little bit like looking for a unicorn.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I think that multiplier effect, yeah, is such a great way of looking at it. I think we interviewed a fair few, well, I think it's like over 60 asking these questions about what it was, and one of the best ones that we had was similar to what you touched on. It's like, you know, a lot of that the terminology being that 10x engineer gets thrown around a lot, and it's like principal engineer. One of them I remember it quite distinctly. It was like principal engineers might not be 10x engineers themselves, but when they do their job properly, they act as that multiplier to that effect. So yeah, and that could be leveraged off, you know, the things that we just mentioned as well, which is highly influential. Do you think the role changes in the environment of where it's in? So in a startup, a scale up, yeah.
100%. Oh yeah, well, not just startup scale up, but also, well, first of all, I don't think startups have principal engineers. In fact, I would argue that at startups, either everyone's a principal engineer or nobody's a principal engineer, depending on how you look at it. Because it's so like, you know, again, because we're talking about that multiplier effect, and multiplier effects they get their power by multiplying across a large number, right? So if you can make a team of 50 people 10% more efficient, then it's like you've done 5 people's worth of work. You make a team of 2 people 10% more efficient, then you're wasting your time. And so, yeah, I think, you know, you want everyone at a startup to be a sort of an adder rather than a multiplier, because the thing that you're multiplying is so small, so what it's doing. But I thought where you were going with that question is, you know, different companies have a different profile of principal engineer. They make my point of define the shape of the hole that you're trying to fill before you fill it. I think it can be really easy, and this is maybe like a bit of a hangover from old-fashioned HR and old-fashioned recruiting, where it's like you have these well-defined job titles and you say, I need this type of thing. But I always prefer to go back to first principles and say, what problem are we trying to solve with this hire? Let's look for the person who can solve this problem. And when you get to principal engineer, the diversity of problems you're trying to solve can be really high. All you know, I think the thing they have in common is that they are hard problems to solve. Most engineers can't solve them. And that's why you're going out looking for this special person.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. You know, it's funny that you touched on that with that sort of old school approach is the best way of what I always got told to sell any role or whatever it was I was recruiting for was, don't talk about the role, the title, talk about the problems that you're trying to solve and communicate the problems to that. And if people resonate with that and they are like, all right, cool, that's what I do. All right, well, I can see that. And, you know, they're going to get a lot more excited about something. I mean, they get calls, particularly in engineering, like they get calls like all the time about any other job, but it's the problems that it's what's going to get people out of bed in the morning, besides obviously the money. But yeah, that's why you sort of continue doing what you do, right? Yeah.
So that's right. And it also allows you to actually cast a wider net because, if you go down that traditional cookie cutter approach, you say, I want a senior engineer with 5 to 7 years experience and they're a .NET backend, whatever. You're ruling out all sorts of people who could potentially be really great at solving the actual problem that you have. Maybe they
Yeah.
only have 4 years experience. Maybe they're not .NET, but they're polyglot. They're really quick learners. So think about what problems is this person going to solve, and then keep more of an open mind about the exact checkbox that they're filling, because it's a very crude instrument and it can actually really screw up your funnel if you sort of screen people out based on these hard requirements.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's the mindset of when you're looking for people, when hiring managers are looking for people, can get a lot bogged down into those hard requirements of that technology driven. But when you said there are a lot of people out there that are those polyglots of what you mentioned that can easily shift the technology skill set, particularly if they've proven they've done it before, like this makes no sense. Yeah. And it goes back to that mindset of what we're talking about before, of when if you were joining a startup of the people you're looking for, of like, are you smart and do you get shit done? The technical
Yep.
side of things can probably sort of sort themselves out, right? So
Yeah, that's right. And like, yeah, I think especially on engineers, right? Like, for me, the best software engineers don't categorize themselves as front end or back end or .NET or Go or Java or JavaScript or whatever. They are define themselves by their ability to solve problems using software. And the truth is, as a software engineer, you have to be a lifelong learner because the technology is constantly changing. So what does it matter what technology you've used in the past? The core skill is the skill of software development and the skill of learning how to use new tools. So, I think companies are far too afraid, and a lot of engineers have this learned helplessness where they're like, oh, if my background is in Golang, I should only apply for Golang jobs. I think that's a really limiting way of thinking about yourself and your career. And for companies, it's a really limiting way of finding the best talent.
yeah, it's so refreshing coming from someone at your level to say that. No one listen to that, because usually when we're out there on the tools, or on the front line recruiting, it's that opposite conversation. We're having these, saying the exact same thing to try to convince them that the otherwise. So yeah, but you touched on something that in our email chain before, is like the difference in a startup of like the CTO and the VP of engineering.
Yeah.
What do you want to dig a bit deeper about that, about those two roles and how they sort of change in the different companies?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I'd say, like, I bring it up, but it's also something that's always confused me a little bit. But I sort of mention it to you in the
Mm,
context of this principal engineer thing, because I think sometimes what the CTO is the principal engineer, right? They're kind of the person whose job it is to map out the technology future for the organization, right? They're the visionary, they're the thinker, they're the person who has that sort of maker time, right? So even though they're C-level, um, and they kind of have responsibility for the whole organization in a sense. If there is a VP of engineering as well, what they're really doing is they're splitting that thought leadership and that sort of mapping out the future aspect of what they do from managing and building an organization. And so the VP of engineering is
mm,
really the manager or the organizational leader who is responsible for hiring, firing, processes, internal communication, all sorts of stuff like that. And the CTO is really more mapping out the future and like setting the technical vision, is probably the lead architect and that sort of thing. But it's funny. I think an underlying theme behind everything we're talking about here is that titles are misleading. Every organization is
mm,
different. If you have, and there are a lot of companies that
mm.
only have a CTO or only have a VP of engineering. In that case, they're just two titles for the same thing. You have one person leading engineering, they're responsible for all the stuff. Whether you call them CTO, VP of engineering, head of engineering, doesn't really make a huge amount of difference, in my opinion. But when you have two, then it's actually really important to two different roles. And I think there is just so much confusion about this. And, I think where it often doesn't work well, I'd be interested if you've got any thoughts on this, is when you have a founding CTO and they're like, you know what, I'm a technologist. I love technology. I don't like the management that much. So I'm going to hire a VP of engineering to do all of that boring stuff, that quote unquote boring stuff. Um,
Mm.
and but then you don't empower that VP of engineering, right? Like you're not
Mm.
properly splitting the role. You're just kind of using them to sort of delegate the stuff you don't like doing, and that can be really confusing for the team, and quite unsatisfying for the VP as well, of course.
Yeah, yeah. That's Yeah, the word delegate there just came in, which makes all sense. Yeah, I've seen it like I don't know if I've like heard that the impact of that in that sort of context of having that co-founder as a technical co-founder and then hire a VP of engineering to do those roles and it not work out. What I've seen is founding teams move on to different roles of the business because what you just described, they haven't liked the part of that aspect, or they've liked they've got, the business has got to a size where it's almost too much. Like they're like, okay, I don't know how to get it to the next phase, and they've bought a CTO who's come on board to take it from 50 to 200 employees and international expansion or whatever it might be around that sort of thing. Or they've had a takeover, an acquisition, and joined a larger business, and the CTOs, I don't want to do this anymore. They don't want to. They love being in that smaller business and that sort of thing. So I haven't seen in the specific example what you just described, but I've seen it in those other instances, and I think that's just again comes down to either like a mindset shift, whether they're willing to learn and adjust to that new environment, or it's something they just don't want to do. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's about getting like clear roles and responsibilities and having a mutual trust relationship. I think it's really important.
Yeah, 100%. A lot does come down to trust. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. You mentioned before that AI coming into play, and it's huge. It's huge. It's everywhere, right? And I think I saw a post today. I follow that Ryan Peterman guy who's he's a staff engineer. What was that? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
He put a post out in saying that about computer science graduates, and he compared it to a lot of different a lot of different sort of science and all just popularized high-end roles. So even like finance, medicine, and things that require like a STEM sort of degree to get into. And it was CompSci. It had like one of the highest paying, jobs, but also the highest unemployment rate as you leave a degree. So it was like 6%. Yeah, it was super interesting. And I was just wondering, like, what is that the it's a little bit off topic of what I was talking about, like the thoughts of the impact of AI and how it's sort of coming into play, particularly over the last couple of years, impacting the adoption of graduate hires in the business. And
I think it's really problematic, to be honest. So it's not even the last couple of years. I'd say the real impact hasn't even been felt yet, which is what's kind of scary, if you ask me. So everything I'm seeing at the moment is that AI coding tools have come on in leaps and bounds in the last 6 months. And a thing I'm hearing very often is 6 months ago I tried the tools and they weren't quite there. It was kind of interesting and fun, but it didn't really make me more productive. And now I try those tools again and I don't really need to write code anymore.
Wow.
And so one of the things that's happening here is for senior engineers, that is incredibly powerful because what they're effectively going from is being coders to being architects and code reviewers. In a sense, these coding tools are acting as junior engineers for these senior engineers. And so a senior engineer can become a lot more productive with these tools, which increases their value in the market, arguably. But at the same time, junior engineers are not able to extract the same value from the tools because really it's that engineering judgment and experience that allows you to use these tools effectively. So you've got this double whammy where the senior engineers can use these tools to some extent as a substitute for working with junior engineers, and junior engineers don't get that same boost from the tools. And so what we're doing is it's great for companies in the short term because basically they don't need to hire and manage as many of these folks. But we're kicking out the bottom few rungs of the career ladder in software engineering. And I think over the medium to long term, it's like, where's the next generation of senior engineers going to come from if they don't get that training? Now, that is not any individual business's problem to solve, right? Every individual startup has the responsibility only to ensure that their own survival and acting ethically within that. They're not a job creation scheme, but I do feel it's a really difficult time to be a junior engineer, and long term, it's a structural issue for the industry.
Yeah, And
Yep.
I see that as well. It's like where and in where are the people exactly what you say? Who's going to be the next mids? Who's going to be the next seniors? You know, when these seniors retire, like, who's going to fill it? Like, what's going to happen? Are they just going to not retire, or will the AI get better that you just don't need engineers anymore? Then everyone's out. Like it's just,
It's, I mean, maybe it's hard to say,
yeah.
but for now, definitely senior engineers and senior plus have never been more valuable because for them, this is just an accelerant to their ability to build software.
Hmm.
Um, maybe they won't be needed one day, but they have that technical taste. They know the right prompts. They know whether the code is good or not. They know how to give feedback to the AI. All the things that they used to do with a junior engineer, that sort of giving it instructions and reviewing their work, they can use those exact same skills they've developed, but they use the AI instead of a junior engineer. It's not quite a one-for-one substitution, but it's scarily close in a lot of cases.
Well, what do you think's going to happen? I mean, like that's the thing. Do you think I did a post about like it kind of being, I don't know, like a football like squad analogy where you have like your Manchester Uniteds and Arsenals and stuff starting these juniors off, like
Yep.
integrating them and like putting them through like a training program, so
Mm.
by the time they sort of come out they're playing at more of an elite level. And but it's all funded by big tech, so you're not going to get that experience at a startup anymore because they're just not there. But you might get it at the big tech environments who have the funding, or maybe like a CBA or something
Mm.
like that. The graduate programs are going to be a hell of a lot different to what they used to be. Probably not working. I don't know. Like it's kind of like what I envisioned anyway. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't have the answers. I'll be honest. I think it's a challenge, but AI is going to disrupt so many things that
hmm,
um, it's just hard to predict the future. I would say, like, just zooming out a bit and being more generalist about it, is
hmm,
you want to develop the sorts of skills that are harder for AI to replicate. And that can be the human factor. Like, if you are a software developer, I think it has never been more important to be kind of commercial, pragmatic, a good communicator. I think the era of, the kind of nerds who like to lock themselves up in a basement and not talk and not communicate is well and truly over. I mean, it's been over for a while, but this just accelerates it, right? Like the best engineers for a while have been the ones who think about being business partners, right?
hmm.
Thinking about the customer, thinking how you serve their needs, working with product management, with design, with sales, with marketing, to provide that value. But when AI can write the code, well, then that's kind of, in a sense, the main thing you have left, especially when you're junior, right? Is how do you connect? How are you creative? How are you pragmatic? How do you join the dots? How do you see the big picture and connect the software that is being built to all those things? So, I think it's a good time to be a generalist. And in a weird way, this advanced technology swings the pendulum a little bit away from the people with the strongest technical skills to people who have that broader set of skills that allow them to leverage the tools and operate in that broader context.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. Uh, um, I think there's so much more for. There's always things to learn, and I think to sort of like future proof your career,
Mm.
it's probably like learning those other skills that I
Yep.
think from if you're going to take what you just said, the typical software engineer nerd in the corner, coding away, not being into it. Yeah,
Yeah.
got to come out of that sort of shell and apply that sort of knowledge to solving those problems. Yeah,
Yeah.
such an important character trait.
Yeah.
Um, we're approaching the end of the pod, mate. So I do have a couple little bonus questions that I
Sure.
like to
Let's
ask at
let's
the
go.
end. What do you think's the most important thing that you've learned from running a podcast?
I'm running my podcast. Oh, it's
Mm,
interesting. So I mentioned at the beginning of this episode that it kind of started out on a whim. It was just kind of like a little bit of fun. And then we started doing it, and it took on a bit of a life of its own because, Chris and I are both busy people. We have other stuff to do. You probably know, Sam, that running and editing and producing a podcast is actually quite a lot of work. And so you then start needing to get help. We started to need to get help, and help isn't free. So suddenly we're like, oh, if we need to pay for this help, then we need to have some revenue to pay for it. And so we started looking for sponsorships and so on. And then you look back and I'm like, oh, we're now running a bootstrapped business. We weren't
mm,
planning to. we're not actually taking any money out of it, nor do we necessarily expect to or plan to in the future. Nonetheless, we're running a business. Now we need to be thinking about growth, marketing, sales, positioning, all of this collateral. We're, managing a small team. And that's been sort of surprising and in a weird way rewarding, because although I was co-founder of Circular, that was from the beginning kind of an investor-backed sort of Silicon Valley style business, and that's sort of the world that I've been in, the sort of the venture-backed businesses. But now I've also gotten to experience a taste of the other type of business, which is you start from nothing, and the only way you get to spend money is by making money. And I think that's just really helped round out my knowledge base of how you can build and operate businesses. And it's actually been, it's made me better at both kinds of things because I can understand the differences. And so, yeah, I guess that education was not something I was expecting to come from that podcast. And I found it really
Yeah.
fascinating and really valuable.
Yeah, how good, how good. If you could give, with that taken on board, if you could give any piece of advice for a first-time founder, what would it be?
Listen to the Startup podcast.
Yes, nice. There's a lot on there. Yeah, there is a lot on there.
I mean, semi-seriously, because our aim there is really to provide education to founders. But if I was to give them one piece of advice, it's to know the rules of the game, right? Like, in a sense, when you're starting a startup, you are signing up for one of several different types of game. And when I say it's a game, I don't mean it's not serious. What I mean is that the way you're trying to build your business, there are certain unwritten rules that you're going to need to be able to follow and be constrained by if you want to succeed. And one of the things that goes wrong the most is people say, "Oh, I want to start a startup," but they haven't chosen which game they're playing. Am I going venture backed? Am I going bootstrapped? Am I sales driven? Am I product led growth or whatever? Any number of things, right? They're not thinking about the game that they're trying to play. And therefore, they not only do they not know the rules of the game, they then don't know the rules of the game. And so they bumble around, they make a lot of mistakes. It can be really heartbreaking because people with a huge amount of passion, skill, intelligence are putting their time, their money, their life force into this thing. And they're making mistakes because it's really hard to play a game when you don't know what game you're playing and when you don't know the rules of it. So really step back, think, take the time to understand. There are a lot of good resources. I was saying, listen to our podcast, but there are amazing books. There are other podcasts. There are so many different things. Educate yourself, because otherwise you're putting all your energy into this thing without even doing that basic due diligence on what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, fantastic. What would be your favorite book, leadership, business, or tech book, and why?
Okay, so well, if you're doing the venture base, there's one called. Just let me pause. I'm going to try and remember the name. It's called Investor versus Founder. I think it's pretty cool. Oh yeah, Founder versus Investor by Elizabeth Zalman and Jerry Newman, except it said Elizabeth Zalman versus Jerry Newman. And it's this really cool book where these two friends, one's a founder, one's an investor, are kind of go back and forth, sharing each other's perspective and the things where they line up and the things where actually the perspectives and the incentives are quite different. So it really gives you a good view into the rules of that venture capital game and what people say versus what they mean versus the underlying reality. It's also a fun read. But even if you're not going down that venture path, in explaining these differences and understanding, it actually goes through a lot of nuance about what it takes to build a startup. So yeah, I'd really recommend that one.
Founder versus investor.
Founder versus Investor.
All right,
Lots of fun.
perfect.
It's available as an audiobook. So yeah, heaps of fun. Good read.
Awesome. All right, cool. Yeah, I love that post you did. It was like the graphic of
Mm,
the investor led and then the bootstrap led, and then there's like the differences in between. And I think it was like product led and all that.
excellent.
I think you did that probably like a month ago.
Yeah.
You shared that. That was cool. Yeah, I highly recommend anyone who's listening to this to look up that post. All right, cool. Last one. Who is the most influential person in your career and why? Or who has been most influential person?
Well, that's a good question. So I had a manager back when I was at Google in Switzerland called Oliver Heckman. He's now VP of Engineering at Grammarly. So he's done very well for himself, but he was a fantastic manager and director because he was actually a person who was able to empower his team under him and really act as that true multiplier that I talk about. And I think I drew a lot of lesson from him into my own career as a manager and as a leader. So yeah, just a really great engineering leader there.
Shout out to Oliver.
Hey, Oliver.
Great. Yaniv, thank you so much for your time. I drew a lot of value from this, and I'm sure a lot of people who listen to it will as well. So yeah, it's been great. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much for having me on, Sam. I enjoyed it a lot.